The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain from a storm just passing outside. Machines hummed and monitors blinked in quiet rhythm, marking the fragile line between life and death. At the center of it all lay Edward Harrison, a man whose life had once roared as loudly as the creatures he had devoted it to saving. Now, at 76, the retired zoologist stared at a sterile white ceiling, his body thin and frail from the cancer that was slowly overtaking him. Nurses came and went with soft footsteps, their faces professional but sympathetic. They had seen hundreds of patients at the end of their journeys, but none like this man who, despite his pain, still carried the calm dignity of someone who had looked wild predators in the eye and earned their trust. Beyond the hospital walls, in a sanctuary 2 hours away, something stirred. A massive lion named Simba, golden mane glinting under the weak winter sun, paced restlessly along the edge of his enclosure. For days he had refused his food, ignoring the concerned calls of his keepers. Each lap he made against the fence seemed heavier, as if some invisible thread bound him to a place he could not reach. Staff whispered among themselves, but the director of the sanctuary knew the truth. Simba was waiting for a man he had not seen in months, the only human he had ever truly trusted. Back in the hospital, Edward's breathing was shallow, yet when his eyes closed, memories flickered behind his lids like an old film reel. A tiny, malnourished cub with a broken leg. Long nights of bottle feeding. Mornings spent teaching an orphaned predator how to trust again. The world might see only a lion behind bars, but Edward saw his boy, the cub he had once cradled like a child. He wondered if Simba remembered him still, and whether the bond they had forged all those years ago had endured the silence and distance. Neither man nor lion could have imagined what would happen next. A journey was about to begin, one that would defy regulations, challenge everything the hospital believed about patients and visitors, and reveal a truth about loyalty and love that no one present would ever forget. Long before hospital beds and beeping monitors, before pain medication dulled his senses and strangers called him Mr. Harrison instead of Edward, there was a boy who spent his afternoons wandering the woods behind his grandparents' farmhouse. Even then, Edward Harrison had a gift, a quiet patience that drew frightened animals from hiding. While other children skipped stones or chased each other through fields, Edward sat still for hours at the edge of the tree line, waiting for foxes or deer to emerge, his heart pounding with wonder, but his hands steady. He never tried to touch them. He simply wanted to understand that patience would become the foundation of his life's work. In college, Edward studied zoology and behavioral ecology, but classrooms only fueled a deeper hunger. "If you want to know an animal," he once wrote in his journal, "you must earn the privilege of its presence." By his mid-30s, he had left a promising academic career to work in the field, not with lab rats or fenced-in herds, but with predators others called unmanageable. Lions, tigers, leopards, jaguars, the kind of creatures people admired from a distance but rarely dared to approach. He believed that even the fiercest animals held an untapped capacity for trust if given consistency, respect and time. It was in the early 1980s, on a rescue mission in Kenya, that Edward first realized the magnitude of this calling. He had been assisting local rangers when they discovered a lioness killed by poachers, her tiny cub still hidden in the brush nearby. The cub's leg was mangled, his ribs visible beneath patchy fur. Everyone said the same thing: too injured to save, too young to survive, too wild to raise. But Edward knelt beside the tiny creature and saw not a doomed animal, but a challenge, a life worth fighting for. Against all advice, he bundled the cub in his arms and began a journey that would change both their destinies. Back in Minnesota, Edward built a makeshift enclosure on the edge of the fledgling wildlife sanctuary he'd co-founded, a place that, at the time, was little more than a few wooden pens and a dream. Day and night he tended to the cub, who he named Simba for his regal bearing even in weakness. He mixed formula by hand, slept on the floor beside the crate where Simba lay, and set the broken leg himself with the help of a sympathetic veterinarian. Weeks turned into months. Against all odds, the cub survived, then thrived. His fur grew thick, his eyes brightened, and a bond formed between man and lion that stunned everyone who witnessed it. Edward didn't treat Simba like a pet. He treated him like a being with dignity, teaching him boundaries and trust the way a mother lion would. He never used force, only patience. Sanctuary volunteers would later recall seeing Edward crouched in the grass of the enclosure, letting the young lion stalk him in play, or lying flat on his back as Simba, now 100 pounds, padded cautiously over him. He taught the cub courage, one volunteer said, and the cub taught him faith. As the sanctuary grew, so did Edward's reputation. He became known not just as a zoologist, but as a lion whisperer, though he disliked the term. He insisted there was nothing mystical about what he did, only time, respect, and a refusal to give up on an animal because it was inconvenient or dangerous. Over the next 3 decades, he would hand-raise dozens of orphaned big cats, rehabilitating them for life in spacious enclosures or, when possible, returning them to the wild. Yet even among all those rescues, Simba remained singular. For 15 years, until Edward's retirement, they were inseparable. Simba's enclosure opened directly into a secure section of Edward's cabin. They would walk the sanctuary together at dawn, Edward with his coffee mug and notebook, Simba padding silently at his side like an enormous shadow. When Edward finally stepped back from daily operations, it wasn't because his passion had dimmed, but because his body had begun to fail him. Years of hard labor, travel, and exposure had taken their toll. Still, he visited the sanctuary every week, often sitting for hours by Simba's enclosure, speaking softly to the lion, who would press his massive head against the fence in greeting. Even after Edward's cancer diagnosis 3 months ago, he made the trip whenever treatment allowed, leaning on a cane, but still smiling at the sight of his old companion. People often asked Edward why he risked so much for these animals. He would answer with a small smile and a shrug. "Because someone has to," he'd say. But in his private writings he was more candid. "They are not beasts," one entry read. "They are lives. They remember, they feel, they grieve, they forgive. The least I can do is stand by them as they stand by me." It was this man, patient, stubborn, and quietly extraordinary, who now lay in a hospital bed, days from death, unaware that somewhere in a sanctuary, a lion was pacing, restless, as if feeling the pull of an invisible thread. A story that had begun with a broken cub decades ago was about to circle back to its starting point, in a way no one could have predicted. In the sanctuary's oldest enclosure, built with reinforced fencing and shaded by tall oaks, Simba had grown from a fragile cub into a majestic adult lion. Visitors gasped when they saw him for the first time. The size of his paws, the glint of his amber eyes, the sheer mass of his shoulders as he moved. Yet what struck most observers wasn't his power, but his composure. Unlike other lions, who often paced or roared at strangers, Simba watched quietly, his gaze steady but calm. "He's different," keepers often said, "like he knows more than he should." Simba's early years were spent almost entirely with Edward. He learned the smell of Edward's hands, the sound of his voice, the rhythm of his footsteps on gravel. Edward never raised his voice or struck him. Discipline came through patience and consistency. As a cub, Simba would cry at night until Edward slid his sleeping bag next to the crate. As a juvenile, he followed Edward everywhere, to staff meetings, to medical checkups of other animals, even once onto the porch of the main office where he sprawled like an oversized house cat as Edward signed paperwork. Sanctuary workers used to joke that Simba thought Edward was his pride, and perhaps he did. By the time Simba reached full adulthood, weighing more than 400 pounds, he could have injured Edward with a single swipe. Yet he never did. Even in play, his claws stayed sheathed. There were moments, a tug of a sleeve, a mock tackle in the grass, when others held their breath, but Edward never flinched. "Trust is a living thing," he told new volunteers. "Feed it and it grows. Starve it and it dies. When Edward retired, Simba adjusted at first, but his keepers noticed a change. He became restless on the days Edward didn't visit, pacing more, roaring at dusk. The bond forged over 15 years could not be unlearned in a few months. Even as he aged into his 20s, a venerable age for a lion, Simba would perk up at the sound of Edward's truck pulling onto the gravel road, pressing his head against the fence like a dog greeting its master. On days Edward was too sick to come, Simba sometimes refused food, lying with his head on his paws, staring toward the entrance of the sanctuary as if waiting. When Edward stopped coming altogether after his hospitalization, Simba's decline became obvious. His mane lost its luster. His appetite dropped. He prowled the edges of his enclosure, vocalizing with low, mournful calls that carried across the sanctuary at night. The staff tried to comfort him, bringing his favorite treats, playing recordings of Edward's voice, but nothing worked. "He's grieving," the sanctuary veterinarian said quietly. "He knows something's wrong." No one could explain how Simba sensed Edward's absence so deeply. Perhaps it was smell or sound, or some instinctive awareness beyond human understanding. Whatever the reason, the old lion's behavior alarmed the staff enough that the director, Robert Thompson, made an extraordinary decision. If Edward couldn't come to Simba, then Simba would go to Edward. It would be risky, unprecedented, a full-grown male lion inside a hospital. But as Thompson told the hospital administrator, this isn't just an animal. This is family. What neither Thompson nor Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Edward's attending physician, yet understood was how powerful that reunion would be, not just for the man and the lion, but for everyone who witnessed it. A story decades in the making was about to reach its most astonishing chapter. Edward Harrison's world had shrunk to a single white room on the 5th floor of St. Mary's Hospital. Once his days had been filled with dawn walks through dew-wet grass and the heavy warmth of a lion's shoulder brushing against his leg. Now he spent them watching clouds drift past a narrow window. He tried not to think about the sanctuary. He tried not to think about Simba. But when the pain eased and the medication softened the edges of his fear, his mind always wandered back to that first day in Kenya. The broken cub blinking up at him with trembling paws. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had read about Edward before she became his physician. In college, she'd even written a paper on his sanctuary's rehabilitation methods. Meeting him in person had been like meeting a living legend. Yet the man in the hospital bed bore little resemblance to the robust figure in those old documentaries. His once broad shoulders were thin beneath the gown. His hands trembled as they reached for a glass of water. Only his eyes remained unchanged, calm, steady, with that same quiet patience. "You've had visitors," Sarah said one afternoon, checking his chart. "Former volunteers, donors. They all ask about the lion." Edward smiled faintly. "Simba, my boy." He paused. "He doesn't know where I am." Sarah hesitated. The sanctuary director called. "He said Simba's not eating." Edward closed his eyes, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "He'll be all right. He's strong, but inside a knot tightened." Simba wasn't just strong, he was sensitive. The bond they shared was more than habit. It was, Edward suspected, something deeper, a kind of chosen kinship that defied species. Across town, Robert Thompson, the sanctuary's director, was staring at Simba's enclosure with growing concern. "This can't go on," he said to his deputy. "If Edward can't come here, maybe we take Simba to him." His deputy gaped. "To a hospital?" "Robert, he's a full-grown lion." "I know," Robert said quietly. "But this lion is dying of a broken heart." The plan was audacious, unprecedented. But as word spread among the staff, support grew. Volunteers offered to help. Veterinarians began making lists of sedatives, restraints, and transport protocols. "It's crazy," one of them muttered. "But it's the right kind of crazy." Back at the hospital, Sarah received a phone call that made her sit up straight. "You want to do what?" she asked, gripping the receiver. She listened as Robert explained. She looked over at Edward, who was dozing, and for a moment she pictured it. A massive lion, padding silently into the ward, head low, eyes searching. It sounded impossible, dangerous, but it also felt necessary. "Give me 24 hours, she said finally. "I'll see what I can do." What followed was a flurry of negotiations, liability waivers, and hushed conversations behind closed doors. The hospital board balked at first. A lion in a hospital? Absolutely not. But Sarah argued, Robert pleaded, and eventually, under strict conditions, they agreed. The visit would happen after hours, in a private room cleared of unnecessary equipment. Simba would be sedated lightly, enough to keep him calm, but not unconscious. A team of handlers would remain nearby at all times. No one knew how Edward would react. The plan was to surprise him, to give him in his final days a reunion that might bring peace to both man and beast. "If anyone deserves it," Sarah told the board, "it's him." And so, as the winter sun dipped below the horizon, a convoy left the sanctuary, carrying an aging lion toward a city hospital, and toward the man who had once carried him. The hospital's loading bay had never seen anything like it. Under flickering fluorescent lights, a specially reinforced transport crate was lowered from a truck. Inside, Simba shifted, a low rumble in his chest. His mane was streaked with silver now, his eyes dulled with age and worry, but his presence filled the space like thunder. Robert walked alongside the handlers, murmuring to the lion through the slats. "Easy, boy. We're almost there." Inside the hospital, Dr. Sarah Mitchell oversaw the final preparations. Edward's room had been cleared of all unnecessary equipment. The bed had been moved back to make space. A soft blanket lay on the floor, near the foot of the bed, just in case. Nurses watched with wide eyes as the team wheeled the crate through the halls. Some took out their phones, only to be gently told to put them away. This wasn't a spectacle. This was something sacred. When the crate reached the room, the handlers paused. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Robert glanced at Sarah. "Ready?" She nodded. "Let's do it." The door opened. The crate rolled inside. Edward stirred, blinking in confusion. What's going on?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "We have a visitor for you," Sarah said softly. The handlers unlatched the crate's door, but did not open it yet. They gave Edward a moment. The old man pushed himself up on his elbows, eyes narrowing. Then he heard it, a low, familiar sound, halfway between a purr and a rumble. His breath caught. "Simba?" he whispered. The handlers swung the door open. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then slowly a massive paw extended, followed by another. Simba stepped out, his movements deliberate, his nose working the air. The room fell utterly silent. Nurses pressed themselves against the wall. Simba's gaze found Edward. Something passed across his face, recognition, relief, something almost human. He lowered his head and gave a deep, rolling chuff. Edward's eyes filled with tears. "My boy," he whispered. Against every protocol, Edward swung his legs over the side of the bed and reached out a trembling hand. Simba moved forward, each step measured, until his nose touched the back of Edward's fingers. A sound emerged from the lion's chest. A deep, vibrating rumble like a purr, amplified 100 times. Edward let out a shuddering sob. "I thought you'd forgotten me." Simba pressed his massive head against Edward's lap, careful, almost gentle. Edward's fingers sank into the coarse mane. Around them, everyone held their breath. For a few long moments, there was no hospital, no illness, no species divide, only an old man and an old lion, reunited at last. The handlers had expected Simba to be anxious, to pace or roar. Instead, he became utterly still, as though aware of the gravity of the moment. He lay down beside Edward's bed, his flank rising and falling in slow rhythm. His golden eyes fixed on the man who had saved him. Edward stroked the lion's mane, his hands trembling not with fear, but with joy. "Do you remember," he murmured, "the nights in the cabin? You snored louder than the wind." Simba blinked slowly, leaning into the touch. Dr. Sarah felt tears prick her own eyes. She had seen extraordinary things in her career, but nothing like this. "He knows," she whispered to Robert. "He really knows." Robert nodded, unable to speak. Edward began to talk, to Simba, to the room, to himself. He recounted the rescue in Kenya, the bottle feedings, the first time Simba ran without limping. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if drawing energy from the memories. "You were so small," he said, chuckling weakly. "Fit in my arms. Look at you now." Simba made a soft, almost plaintive sound, and Edward's eyes shone. "It's all right," he said. "I'm all right." Then something happened that no one expected. Simba shifted, rising carefully onto his paws, and placed one massive paw, claws sheathed, on the edge of the bed, just beside Edward's hip. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward until his forehead rested against Edward's chest. The old man closed his eyes, tears running down his cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered. Cameras would later capture that moment. The lion bowing his head, the man's hand resting on the mane. It would go viral, shared around the world as proof of a bond beyond comprehension. But in that room it was not a spectacle. It was a farewell. Edward's breathing slowed, but his face was peaceful. He murmured words only Simba could hear. The lion listened, eyes half closed, his body curved protectively around the bed. The staff allowed them an hour. Then two. No one wanted to break the spell. At last Edward lay back, his strength fading. "You can go now," he whispered, though his fingers still clutched the mane. "You're free." Simba stayed a little longer, his eyes never leaving Edward's face. Then with a deep, resonant chuff, he stepped back. The handlers guided him gently toward the crate, but he paused at the doorway, turning once more to look at the man in the bed. Edward smiled faintly. "Goodbye, my boy." Simba lowered his head, a gesture so deliberate it seemed like a nod. And then he was gone, padding silently down the hall, leaving behind a room that felt for a moment like holy ground. Edward passed away 2 days later, peacefully in his sleep. Dr. Sarah was on call that night. She swore she heard faint and distant the echo of a lion's roar as she closed his chart. News of the visit spread quickly. Photos and video taken by hospital staff, originally meant as documentation for safety, were shared online. Within hours they went viral. Headlines appeared. Lion bids farewell to dying man who saved him. A bond beyond species, the visit that broke the internet. The sanctuary received thousands of messages from around the world. People wrote about their own animals, about second chances, about love. Donations poured in, enough to expand the enclosures and fund rescue missions for years to come. Robert called it Edward's final miracle. Simba returned to his enclosure quieter but calmer, his appetite slowly returning. He spent hours lying in the sun, eyes half closed, as if remembering. Staff noticed he often lay near the gate at dawn, the same spot where he had once waited for Edward's truck. At Edward's memorial service, a large photo stood at the front, Edward with a tiny lion cub cradled in his arms. Beneath it was a handwritten quote from Edward's journal: "They are not beasts. They are lives. They remember." People spoke of his courage, his patience, his legacy. But the moment everyone remembered most wasn't in the speeches or the photo montage. It was the sight of an old lion pressing his head to a dying man's chest, saying goodbye in a language older than words. Months after Edward Harrison's death, Dr. Sarah Mitchell found herself back at Oakdale Sanctuary. The winter snow had melted, revealing the earth beneath, and the air smelled of pine and thawing soil. She walked the familiar gravel path toward the cabin that had been Edward's home. Through the fence, she saw Simba, lying beneath a large oak tree. His coat, though grizzled, had regained its luster. Sarah paused at the fence, studying him. The lion lifted his head, amber eyes meeting hers. For a moment she swore she saw recognition there, not of her, perhaps, but of that night, of the man who had saved him. She thought of her training, of how she'd been taught to see animals as subjects of observation, as data points. But Edward had known better. "They are not beasts," his journal had said. "They are lives. They remember." She now understood what he had meant. Inside the cabin, everything had been left as it was. A photograph of Edward with a young Simba stood on the mantel. His journal lay open on the desk, its last entry written in a shaky hand: "Simba is here. I am at peace." Sarah traced the words with her fingertip. She felt as though she was standing in the quiet wake of something sacred. That night, she stayed until sunset. As the sky blazed orange and gold, Simba rose and moved to the gate near the cabin. He stood there, gazing out across the field, a low rumble rising from his chest. It was not a roar. It was something softer, like a hymn. Sarah realized then that the lion was not mourning. He was remembering. The story of Edward and Simba spread far beyond Minnesota. It appeared on the evening news, in newspapers, in magazines. A National Geographic documentary called The Lion's Vigil captured footage from the hospital and sanctuary. It won awards for its rare glimpse of cross-species connection. Viewers wrote in from across the globe. A school teacher in India told her students about the story as a lesson on compassion. A wildlife officer in Kenya cited it in a speech about conservation ethics. Pet owners shared photos of their own animals, writing, "They remember too." Robert Thompson expanded the sanctuary's educational programs, renaming its visitor center the Harrison House. Donations funded new enclosures, veterinary facilities, and scholarships for young conservationists. But perhaps the most significant impact was harder to measure. People who had once seen lions only as predators began to see them as beings with emotions, memories, and loyalty. "We underestimate their capacity for love," Sarah said in an interview. Edward never did. Simba lived another year, spending his days in the cabin and its connected enclosure. Volunteers noted that he often lay on the very spot where Edward's bed had been, his head lifted as though listening to a voice only he could hear. When he passed peacefully in his sleep at the remarkable age of 23, he was buried under the oak tree near the cabin. A small plaque reads, "Simba he remembered. Visitors leave flowers there still." The story became not just a viral sensation, but a parable about loyalty, gratitude, and the invisible bonds that thread through all living beings. If you were to stand today beneath the oak tree at Oakdale Sanctuary, you would find two names entwined in memory: Edward Harrison and Simba the lion. The wind through the branches sounds like a whisper. The ground beneath your feet holds decades of footsteps, both human and feline. Edward's legacy lives on in the sanctuary's work and in every rescued animal given a second chance. But it also lives on in the hearts of people who heard this story and felt something shift inside them. A reminder that compassion crosses boundaries, that gratitude can outlive a lifetime, that even a lion can love. As Dr. Sarah said at the dedication ceremony for Simba's plaque, some bonds are so profound they cannot be measured by science. They can only be witnessed. If this story moved you, let it be more than just a story. Support your local wildlife rescue. Volunteer, donate. Teach your children about empathy, and not just for people, but for all living creatures. The world Edward envisioned, where no orphaned cub is left to die, begins with each of us, and perhaps one day you too will stand at Oakdale Sanctuary, listening to the wind in the oak tree, and know that somewhere, somehow, Edward and Simba are still walking together.